Imagine standing in a grand ancient hall. The walls are lined with history, the air is thick with tradition. A king stands before his people ready to speak. But then something goes terribly wrong. He stops, his voice fades, his eyes go blank. For 3 whole minutes, the most powerful man in the country stands frozen, unable to move or speak. And the worst part, nobody is allowed to help him. This is a story about that moment, about what it revealed, and about the extraordinary decision a king made to protect his crown from ever being that vulnerable again. Let me take you inside the palace walls, where a terrifying incident changed everything. It happened during a private ceremony at Windsor Castle. King Charles, who was 77 and fighting cancer, stood before senior military commanders and officials from around the world. He was supposed to deliver a formal address, but mid-sentence something happened. His body gave out, his gaze went distant, he froze completely. For 180 seconds the king stood there, immobilized, unable to continue, while everyone in the room watched in stunned silence. Now here is where it gets really strange. The senior military aide whose job was to assist the king could not move. The royal guard stood frozen alongside him, not because they did not want to help, not because they were shocked, but because the rules that governed these ceremonies for centuries literally had no written legal permission for anyone to step in while the monarch was still conscious. The staff was legally powerless to act. The old laws said that the king was either fully capable or fully dead. There was no in-between, no gray area, no plan for what to do if the monarch became incapacitated but was still alive and aware. So for 3 minutes, the entire ceremony hung in this dangerous, paralyzed vacuum, everyone watching, nobody legally allowed to do a thing. That is when Prince William broke centuries of rigid tradition. He crossed the room on his own, placed his hand on his father's arm, and gently guided the exhausted king to a nearby chair. Without missing a beat, Catherine stepped forward to join her husband. Together, with calm that witnesses described as remarkable, they took over the ceremony. They presented the honors. They steadied the room. They completed the official business that the king could not finish. King Charles recovered his composure later that evening, but the damage was already done. The Windsor incident had exposed a catastrophic flaw in the legal machinery of the British state. There was a dangerous, unacceptable gap between a sudden emergency and the legal power to react. And that gap existed because nobody had ever written down what should happen if the monarch became temporarily incapacitated but remained alive. So Charles started convening late-night consultations. He called his private secretaries and the top constitutional lawyers. This was not about some abstract reform. This was about what he had just experienced firsthand. He had seen how vulnerable the entire institution actually was. The Windsor incident was the final straw. It convinced him that the survival of the monarchy could not rely on vague traditions and hopeful optimism anymore. The crown needed a modern, bulletproof legal framework of shared responsibility. That realization led to the frantic, secretive drafting of new laws that are now transforming the palace. King Charles ultimately signed a legislative framework that does not just delegate chores or create a symbolic title for William. It strategically maximizes the constitutional authority of the legitimate heir, ensuring that the monarchy remains impenetrable during times of sudden vulnerability. The most striking change focuses on top-secret privileges. For centuries, the highly classified government briefing documents, the famous red boxes, were the exclusive domain of the reigning monarch. Nobody else saw them. That was the rule. Under the new decrees, Prince William and Catherine have been granted unrestricted access to these weekly reports alongside the king. They are no longer waiting to inherit the knowledge of the state. They are actively absorbing it right now in real time. They have also been given full access to the national succession files. That means there is an uninterrupted flow of intelligence that guarantees immediate continuity if any crisis hits. The office of the Prince of Wales has undergone a massive expansion. King Charles has legally transferred supreme decision-making authority regarding long-term state ceremonies and Commonwealth diplomatic strategies to his son. William is now the practical architect of the United Kingdom's global royal presence. By handing over these vast portfolios, the king is ensuring that the international relationships binding the Commonwealth together are managed by the man who will ultimately inherit them. There is no dangerous delay in executive action anymore. If something needs to be decided about Commonwealth strategy, William has the legal authority to make that decision now. But honestly, the most revolutionary part of these new decrees is not about William at all. It is about Catherine. In the dense legal text of the succession framework, her name appears repeatedly, formally identifying her as an essential element for the survival of the monarchy. The law explicitly strips away the outdated expectation that she is merely a decorative consort. Instead, Catherine is now legally protected and recognized as a senior constitutional advisor with direct participation in shaping long-term royal strategy. Her voice is now a mandatory component of the institutional future of the crown. That is not symbolic language. That is binding legal text that fundamentally changes what it means to be the Princess of Wales. This shift was captured in a deeply symbolic moment broadcast to the nation. As the royal family prepared for a public appearance, King Charles reached out to adjust the ceremonial insignia on William's uniform. No words were spoken, but the gesture itself delivered a clear declaration. It signaled that this expansion of power is not an abdication, it is not a usurpation by an impatient heir. It is a deliberate, wise preparation for the greater good of the realm. The king, recognizing his own mortality, chose to fortify the crown by standing shoulder to shoulder with his successors. Now, you would think a decision this significant would have universal support within the palace walls. That is not what happened. The internal conflict that erupted when King Charles presented this framework to his family was intense, deeply personal, and exposed a profound fracture between the old guard and the unstoppable advance of the future co-regency. The center of the internal opposition was Queen Camilla. Her resistance to the new decrees exploded into an unprecedented domestic confrontation. Her position is actually complicated if you think about it from her perspective. For decades, her journey within the royal family had been defined by a relentless climb against public hostility and institutional skepticism. She fought for years to finally secure her status alongside Charles. The sudden introduction of this new succession framework threatened to undo the stability she had fought so long to achieve. If William and Catherine received formalized constitutional power in the present day, the center of gravity within the palace would shift instantly away from her. She saw that with absolute clarity. The confrontation came to a head in a tense, restricted meeting convened by the king. No advisors were permitted to speak. No secretaries were present. Charles placed the draft text of the new law directly on the table between himself, Camilla, William, and Catherine. For the first time, the four central figures of the monarchy were forced to confront the stark division of future power face to face. During this meeting, Camilla became the sole voice of open defiance. Her tone remained composed, but it carried an undercurrent of deep anxiety. She questioned whether the new law would systematically diminish the relevance of the current queen. She warned Charles that institutions almost always use the comforting word, continuation, when they actually intend to execute an accelerated transfer of real power. And honestly, she was not wrong to ask the question. If you are the queen consort and you are watching the future king and queen receive legal authority that was previously reserved exclusively for the reigning monarch, you are going to wonder what that means for your own position. The room became suffocatingly quiet. King Charles responded with an iron resolve that stunned those present. He pushed back his chair, placed his palms flat on the wooden table, and informed the queen that the ultimate decision belonged to him alone. In that definitive moment, William witnessed his father choose the long-term survival of the crown over the domestic peace of his own household. Catherine stood in silent, unwavering support of the king's judgment. The consequences materialized immediately after the official signing of the document. The following morning, Camilla entered her private office, expecting to find the familiar red box containing the highly classified government briefings. The box was entirely absent from her desk. A senior aide had to explain that under the new security protocols, all high-level intelligence had been permanently rerouted to the expanding office of Prince William. The Queen stared at the empty space on her desk before dismissing the official with rigid politeness. The institution had begun the process of moving past her. What makes this particularly painful from Camilla's perspective is that she was not being punished for anything. She was not being excluded because of some personal failing. She was simply on the wrong side of a structural reorganization that prioritized the future over the present. The red box disappeared from her desk, not because Charles was angry with her, but because the legal framework now required that information to flow directly to William and Catherine. Her irrelevance was not personal, it was procedural, and in some ways that is worse. William's response to the spreading pain within his family was completely unyielding. He refused all subsequent requests from palace aides to soften the legal terms of the act. He understood that a compromised, half-hearted allocation of power would only revive the dangerous instability that had paralyzed the staff at Windsor Castle. Incomplete authority would breed constitutional chaos when the nation required absolute clarity. But that does not mean this was easy for him. William had to navigate a profound emotional struggle. He accepted the massive expansion of his daily authority with a heavy heart, constantly aware of how his new role might be perceived by the public. He harbored a deep anxiety that his active involvement in matters of state would make him appear impatient, as if he were reaching for the crown while his father was still alive. He dreaded the perception that he was eclipsing the twilight of his father's reign. That is a real psychological burden. Imagine being handed immense power and knowing that accepting it might make you look like you wanted it too much. It was Catherine who ultimately guided William through this emotional minefield. She helped him conquer his internal hesitation by reminding him that refusing these duties out of personal guilt would actively endanger the stability of the country. It would render his father's immense sacrifices meaningless. The future queen possessed a profound understanding that ultimate duty demands total acceptance rather than emotional restraint. Supported by her strength, William made the agonizing decision to sacrifice the immediate peace of his family to secure the permanent stability of the British Constitution. The enactment of the new succession framework immediately unleashed a series of monumental shifts that fundamentally altered the internal power dynamics of the British monarchy. This was not a theoretical adjustment. It was a sweeping reorganization of daily operations within the royal household. Within hours of the king placing his signature on the document, an invisible boundary line was drawn through the palace. Every member of the royal staff instantly understood where the true center of gravity now resided. The traditional lines of reporting that had existed for generations were rotated 180 degrees. Senior courtiers who had spent decades reporting exclusively to the reigning monarch were suddenly ordered to route their briefs through the newly expanded administrative network of William at Kensington Palace. Any long-term state invitations, official diplomatic itineraries, and high-profile public engagements that previously required the direct approval of King Charles now had to be vetted by the team of the Prince of Wales. This administrative pivot gave the heir apparent functional control over the core machinery of the state. While the administrative machinery adapted to this new era, a far more painful transformation was occurring within the private quarters of the family, specifically touching Catherine's life. As part of her elevated constitutional status, she was presented with an extensive, highly classified portfolio regarding the future governance of the realm. Tucked deep within these sensitive papers was a specific legally binding schedule that dealt directly with her oldest son, Prince George, who was only 13 years old. The document explicitly mandated that the young prince must immediately begin a rigorous formalized curriculum of constitutional training, legal education, and statecraft under the supervision of senior jurists. This revelation inflicted a deep emotional wound on Catherine. For over a decade, she had fought a quiet, determined battle to provide her 3 children with a relatively normal, grounded upbringing away from the suffocating scrutiny of royal duty. She had fiercely guarded their childhood, ensuring that George, Charlotte, and Louis could grow up as children before being forced to carry the weight of their destiny. With a single stroke of a pen, that protective shield was shattered. Reading the dense legal requirements for her oldest son, Catherine was forced to confront the heartbreaking reality that the crown had officially claimed his future far sooner than she had ever anticipated. The freedom of her household was permanently diminished, and the immense weight of the throne had officially crossed their threshold. Beyond the private grief of the family, the public reaction sent shock waves through the political landscape. Major media outlets reacted with immense intensity. Constitutional experts and legal scholars flooded the airwaves, universally praising the move as the most significant and courageous reform of the monarchy since the reign of Queen Elizabeth II. They noted that the king had dragged the institution away from its historical reliance on blind tradition, transforming it into a modern entity focused on proactive risk management and national stability. This massive reorganization unfolded against the backdrop of intense international pressure. Palace insiders were acutely aware that this drastic legal fortification was being executed, just before rumors suggested the Duke and Duchess of Sussex were planning to bring their children back to the United Kingdom. By establishing this impenetrable legal framework around William and Catherine, the king effectively constructed an unbreakable steel wall around the core line of succession. This decisive move blocked any potential efforts from the overseas branch of the family to exploit any perceived vulnerability. The timing on that is interesting if you think about it. If the Sussexes were planning a return with their children, the existence of this new legal framework completely changes the landscape they would be walking into. There is no ambiguity about who holds power. There is no vulnerability to exploit. The succession is locked down, legally fortified, and publicly demonstrated. Whatever conversations might have been happening about the Sussexes' return, this legislation ensures those conversations happen on terms that Charles and William have already defined. As the monumental administrative shifts reshaped the outer layers of the royal household, the deepest core of the drama retreated to the absolute privacy of the inner chambers. The public triumph of the new legislation could not automatically mend the delicate and fractured personal relationships between a father and his son. To address the heavy emotional toll, King Charles took the extraordinary step of dismissing all senior ministers, legal advisors, and palace secretaries from the room, leaving the space entirely devoid of official witnesses. In this starkly quiet environment, stripped of grand titles and rigid protocols, the two men stood face to face simply as a father and his son. The legalities of the state had already settled the future of the nation before the eyes of the public, but the private reality of what that future cost them as individuals remained dangerously unresolved. The immediate question hanging in the quiet air was whether this historic sharing of power would bind them closer together or permanently strip away the final remnants of their normal family bond. King Charles chose to speak first. His voice carried the exhaustion of his ongoing health battles, yet remained absolute in its clarity. He informed William that the introduction of this unprecedented succession framework was never born out of a sudden doubt regarding his son's ability to rule. Instead, the king confessed that it arose from a profound and haunting fear that the modern British monarchy had become dangerously dependent on the physical health and continuous presence of a single individual. The survival of the crown could no longer rely exclusively on the outdated cushion of blind custom. It required a transparent, legally bulletproof structure capable of surviving an immediate crisis. William listened with profound understanding. He acknowledged that while previous generations of sovereigns had successfully maintained stability through traditional mystique and loyalty, the rapid pressures of the 21st century demanded a much faster response. A modern democracy required absolute operational clarity and a highly integrated partnership before any hint of national instability could take root in the public mind. In a rare departure from palace luxury, the king personally poured 2 glasses of water, handed one to his son, and sat directly across from him. It was at this moment that Charles made a deeply poignant confession. He stated that placing his signature upon the new decree felt as though he were actively authoring the opening sentence of his own departure from the world. That is a remarkable thing for a reigning monarch to say out loud. It is an acknowledgement of mortality that the institution usually avoids at all cost. William looked at his father and responded with agonizing honesty. He looked directly into his father's eyes and stated that he did not desire the immense power of the crown if the price of accepting it meant that his father felt entirely erased from his own kingdom. The king met his son's gaze with a gentle but unyielding expression, explaining that every true sovereign eventually faces the same monumental choice. A monarch must either protect his own current position for as long as his body allows, or he must make the ultimate sacrifice to protect the institution that will endure long after he is gone. Charles affirmed that this move was not a surrender to weakness. It was a deliberate act of sovereign love and structural foresight. The tension that had burdened their relationship for weeks finally evaporated, replaced by a profound sense of shared mission. As William leaned forward, King Charles demanded a sacred promise regarding the future treatment of Catherine. The king insisted that she must never be reduced to a purely ceremonial figurehead, nor should she ever be isolated by the complex political maneuvers of the royal court. Charles explained that he had purposefully woven her name throughout the entire legal framework, because her genuine warmth and emotional resilience were the only elements capable of preventing the future court from becoming cold, distant, and trapped by its own executive power. William looked at his father and firmly pledged that this partnership was not just his political intention, but would remain his ultimate constitutional duty. That pledge sealed the pact that transformed them from potential rivals into 2 men united under a single heavy burden. The private agreement between the king and the Prince of Wales became the emotional anchor of the entire new framework. The ultimate verdict on this extraordinary constitutional evolution would not be decided by the elite legal circles of London or the private discussions of senior ministers. The true validation came when Charles walked out before the entire nation, flanked directly by William and Catherine on either side, presenting a unified front that redefined the visual language of the British monarchy. The image broadcast across the globe shattered historical fears of institutional rivalry and structural chaos. Charles had not abdicated his sacred throne. William had not executed a subtle usurpation. Catherine had not been elevated through personal ambition, but through a calculated necessity designed to protect the realm. Together, the 3 figures represented a rare and monumental achievement in the long history of the British crown, a transition built entirely upon proactive preparation rather than sudden panic. Rooted in absolute institutional trust, the public appearance made it clear that Charles remains the reigning monarch, possessing full sovereign authority under the law. Not a single line within the new Succession Act undermines his current power. Yet by permanently positioning William and Catherine beside him as the legally recognized guardians of the future, the king replaced traditional anxieties with a profound sense of national predictability. The British public no longer has to wonder what happens if the king becomes incapacitated. The answer is written into law now. There is a framework, there is a process, there are designated individuals with legal authority to act. The terrifying paralysis that occurred at Windsor Castle cannot happen again because the legal gap that caused it has been closed. Moments before the television cameras began recording the historic broadcast, a deeply symbolic interaction occurred in the wings of the chamber. King Charles reached out with a steady hand to adjust the ceremonial insignia on the military uniform of his son. The insignia, a solemn emblem of royal duty and military rank, was straightened by the hands of the monarch himself. William looked at his father with quiet gratitude, and the king responded with a firm, approving nod before they both stepped into the intense glare of the lights. The gesture required no verbal explanation. It provided a clear visual statement that the future king was not replacing his father, but was being meticulously prepared to carry the flame when the day finally arrives. Camilla walked alongside them into the grand hall, her public composure perfectly intact as she chose the path of institutional solidarity over domestic division. Standing beside the king without a hint of outward resentment, her presence helped close the deep emotional wounds that had threatened the peace of the household during the secret negotiations. Simultaneously, Catherine stepped into her expanded role with an aura of quiet determination, fully accepting that her freedom was now permanently bound to the heavy demands of public duty, while knowing that she had been granted the real executive authority necessary to protect both her family and the state. The historical significance of this entire process was never simply about the certainty that William would one day wear the crown. The true legacy of the king's actions lies in his absolute refusal to leave the next generation unprepared, legally vulnerable, or emotionally isolated during a time of national crisis. By utilizing his sovereign power to formalize a system of shared responsibility in the present day, Charles did not bring a premature end to his own historic reign. Instead, he guaranteed that when the final moment of transition inevitably comes, the British crown, the royal family, and the entire United Kingdom will stand completely united, fiercely stable, and entirely ready to face the future. What makes this story genuinely compelling is not the legislation itself. It is the fact that the entire thing was triggered by a 3-minute incident that nobody outside that room was ever supposed to know about. The Windsor Castle freeze exposed a vulnerability that had existed for centuries, hiding in plain sight, waiting for exactly the wrong moment to reveal itself. And when it did, the king did not just recover and move on. He recognized that the vulnerability existed because the institution had prioritized tradition over practical reality. The old rules assumed the monarch would either be fully capable or fully dead, with no gray area in between. But life does not work that way. Illness does not work that way. Exhaustion does not work that way. The gray area is where actual human existence happens. King Charles looked at that 3-minute gap between emergency and response and decided he was not going to let it exist anymore. The legislation he signed does not just protect William's future. It protects the institution from its own outdated assumptions. It acknowledges that sovereignty is not just about the person wearing the crown. It is about the continuity of governance, the stability of the state, and the confidence of the public that someone is always legally empowered to act. By weaving Catherine into the framework alongside William, Charles also acknowledged something that the monarchy has historically resisted admitting, that the spouse of the heir is not just decorative, that emotional intelligence and public trust are forms of power that deserve legal recognition, that the future of the crown depends on partnership, not just inheritance. The private cost of all this was real. Camilla lost her access to the red boxes. Catherine lost her ability to shield George from his destiny. William had to accept power while his father is still alive, knowing how that might look. Charles had to sign a document that felt like authoring the opening sentence of his own departure. But the alternative was leaving the monarchy vulnerable to another 3-minute freeze, or worse, with no legal framework to handle it. And after Windsor Castle, that was simply no longer acceptable. So when you see the images of Charles, William, and Catherine standing together as a unified front, you are not just looking at a photo opportunity. You are looking at the legal and emotional resolution of a crisis that almost nobody knew happened, driven by a king who decided that protecting the future mattered more than protecting his own pride. And honestly, that is not the story anyone expected from this reign.